At my granddaughter Clara's wedding, my son's wife Veronica introduced me to everyone as the old lady who lives in our basement with her cats. The entire room laughed. I just smiled, a quiet storm brewing inside. They thought they had me cornered, but they had no idea what was coming. Stick around to hear my story, like, share, and let me know where you're listening from. The grand ballroom glittered under the soft glow of 1,000 fairy lights, a scene out of a dream, or perhaps a movie. Everything was designed for maximum impact. The towering floral arrangements, the crystal chandeliers that cascaded light across the polished marble, the champagne flutes tinkling in a symphony of celebration. It was Clara's wedding day, and my heart should have swelled with unadulterated joy. Instead, a dull ache throbbed in my chest, a constant reminder that I felt less like a beloved family member and more like an unexpected, unwanted guest, an intruder in this lavish affair. I arrived quietly, dressed in the modest navy dress I had saved for just such an occasion. It was simple, unadorned, a stark contrast to the shimmering gowns and sharp tuxedos that filled the room. My eyes scanned the familiar faces, some offering polite, fleeting smiles, others pointedly looking away. Daniel, my son, caught my gaze from across the room, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he turned to speak with a cluster of important-looking guests. He hadn't even bothered to greet me properly. This was his world now, far removed from the small, quiet life I led. Then a sudden hush fell over the crowd, and Veronica, Daniel's wife, stepped onto a small, raised platform, tapping a champagne flute with a silver spoon. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, cut through the ambient chatter like a knife. "Dearest friends and family," she began, her smile wide and artificial. "I know many of you have traveled far to be here for Clara's big day, and we are so grateful. But there's one very special guest I simply must introduce, someone who has truly made sacrifices to be here." Her gaze, sharp and calculated, landed on me. My stomach clenched. I knew this performance. "Please, everyone," Veronica continued, her voice dripping with an exaggerated sweetness that fooled no one in the know. "Let me present Eleanor, my husband Daniel's mother, and of course, Clara's grandmother." She paused for effect, her eyes sweeping over the attentive faces. A few polite claps followed, hesitant and sparse. My cheeks began to burn. "Eleanor," Veronica announced, drawing out my name as if it were a foreign curiosity, "is truly a marvel. She's been living with us, for quite some time now." She chuckled, a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "In our charming basement apartment." A ripple of laughter went through the room. I recognized the faces among the chuckling crowd. Distant relatives, Daniel's business associates, Clara's new in-laws. Their amusement felt like a physical blow. Veronica leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though it was still perfectly audible. "And," she added, her eyes twinkling with malice, "she's brought her beloved feline companions along, all 7 of them. It's quite the, shall we say, aromatic arrangement down there." More laughter, louder this time, less hesitant. The sound washed over me, a wave of humiliation. My face flushed crimson, and I could feel my hands trembling slightly. They were laughing at me, at my meager living situation, at my only comfort, my cats. I scanned the room, a desperate plea in my eyes, but found only pitying glances or outright amusement. My gaze finally snagged on Clara. My beautiful granddaughter, radiant in her white gown, stood by her new husband, Liam. Her face was a mask of horror, her eyes widened with a shock and distress. She started to move, a clear intention to come to my aid. But Liam's hand gently yet firmly touched her arm, restraining her. A silent warning, perhaps not to disrupt her own wedding for a scene. Clara's helplessness only twisted the knife deeper. A lifetime of enduring hushed judgments and veiled insults had taught me one thing: never let them see you break. So I did what I always did. I forced a smile, a brittle, unconvincing mask of amusement. I even gave a small, self-deprecating shrug as if to say, "Oh, Veronica, you're such a wag," always with the jokes. The performance was for me as much as for them, a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of dignity. But the laughter didn't subside. It just changed, morphing into a pitying murmur. I could almost hear the thoughts. Poor old Eleanor, trying to make light of her pathetic situation. With my forced smile still plastered on my face, I mumbled something about needing to refresh myself and navigated through the tables, the lingering echoes of their laughter, a burning brand on my back. I found refuge in the ornate ladies' restroom. The cool marble and hushed silence a welcome balm after the public spectacle. I locked myself in a stall for a moment, just breathing, trying to calm the frantic flutter in my chest. Then I pushed open the door and stepped before the large, gilded mirror. My reflection stared back at me. An old woman, hair styled simply, eyes a little tired, lines etched around her mouth from years of unvoiced disappointments. But as I looked closer, beyond the superficial signs of age and the lingering shame, I saw something else. A flicker, a spark that had lain dormant for too long began to stir deep within me. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a cold, quiet power, a resolve forged in the fires of countless humiliations. My hand instinctively went to my left ring finger, tracing the simple, unadorned gold band that had rested there for 2 years now. It wasn't the sparkling diamond of a first marriage, nor the elaborate piece of a grand, romantic gesture. It was humble, unassuming, and yet it was a symbol of a secret so profound, so utterly life-changing, that no one in that ballroom, especially Veronica, could ever have conceived of it. This ring, this secret, was my anchor, my promise. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my lips, a genuine one this time, full of a quiet, potent anticipation. The shame was still there, a hot ember beneath my skin, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of certainty. I would endure this. I would smile and nod and play the part they expected of me, the pathetic old woman they housed out of reluctant obligation. But their laughter, their scorn, their complete dismissal of me, it was all just fuel. They had no idea who they were dealing with. None of them did. The last laugh, I promised myself, would be mine. The coolness of the restroom mirror offered little comfort, but it did provide a quiet space to collect myself. Staring at my reflection, the echo of Veronica's mocking words still stinging my ears, my mind drifted back, tracing the insidious path that had led me to this humiliating moment. 15 years. 15 years of subtle digs, veiled criticisms, and ultimately, overt disrespect, all orchestrated by Veronica to diminish my standing, to erase my presence, piece by agonizing piece. It hadn't happened there overnight. It was a slow, calculated erosion, like water wearing away stone. I remembered the first time I met her. Daniel, my son, had brought her home for Sunday dinner, beaming with an almost boyish pride. She was beautiful, undeniably so, with sharp features and an even sharper intelligence that I initially admired. She'd walked into my small, cozy home, a place filled with the warmth of family and memories, and surveyed it with an almost clinical detachment. "Oh, it's so quaint," she'd remarked, her eyes lingering on my antique china cabinet, the hand-stitched quilt on the sofa, the framed photographs of Richard and Daniel scattered throughout. The word quaint, spoken with that particular inflection, wasn't a compliment. It was a subtle dismissal, a judgment disguised as polite observation, marking my home as something charmingly old-fashioned, but ultimately inferior. After they married, the holidays became a battleground of passive aggression. I loved hosting, filling my home with the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon, gathering everyone around a table laden with food I had lovingly prepared. But Veronica had a critique for everything. My gravy was too rich, my mashed potatoes weren't light enough, my decorations were a bit much. I'd bite my tongue, smile politely, and pretend her comments were helpful suggestions rather than thinly veiled insults. Daniel, caught in the middle, would usually just clear his throat or change the subject, never directly challenging her. It hurt, but I told myself it was just Veronica's way, that she was particular. I wanted to believe it. Then Clara was born, my first grandchild, a tiny bundle of pure joy that promised to mend the subtle fractures in our family dynamic. I was ecstatic, ready to immerse myself in the role of doting grandmother. I imagined baking cookies, reading bedtime stories, teaching her to plant seeds in the garden. But Veronica quickly redefined my role. I wasn't a grandmother, I was an unpaid babysitter, a convenient free childcare option. My excitement was leveraged, my love exploited. I remember one afternoon Clara, barely a toddler, was fussing. I offered her a cracker, a simple, plain biscuit to soothe her. Veronica snatched it away, her eyes flashing with disapproval. "Don't feed her that, Eleanor," she snapped, her voice tight with barely suppressed anger. "It's not organic." She held up a small, perfectly shaped rice cake from her own bag. The implication was clear. I was old-fashioned, ignorant, perhaps even dangerous, for not understanding the nuances of modern, proper child rearing. My heart sank. It wasn't about the cracker. It was about control, about reminding me of my diminished authority in Clara's life. As Clara grew and then Marcus arrived a few years later, my visits became shorter, more regimented. Veronica set strict schedules, dictated menus, and provided detailed instructions for every aspect of the children's care, leaving no room for my own intuition or grandmotherly instincts. My role was reduced to following her orders. The joy I once felt was slowly replaced by a sense of stifling confinement and a growing ache of rejection. The biggest shift came after Richard, my beloved husband, passed away. The grief was immense, a heavy shroud that settled over everything. Life felt fragile, uncertain. The house, once vibrant with our shared history, now felt too large, too empty. I made a difficult, but ultimately pragmatic, decision. I wanted to downsize, to live independently but affordably. The basement apartment in Daniel and Veronica's sprawling house seemed like a reasonable compromise. It offered a separate entrance, a small kitchen, and a living space that felt like my own, even if it was below ground. I saw it as a way to maintain my independence, to be close to my grandchildren, and to manage my finances without burdening Daniel. Veronica, however, saw it differently. She twisted my practical decision into irrefutable proof of my failure. My inability to maintain my former home, my need for their charity, became a constant refrain in her narrative. "Poor Eleanor," she would say to relatives with a sigh of exaggerated concern. "She just couldn't manage after Richard. Of course, we had to step in. It's the least family can do." She offered help with a hidden string attached to every gesture, perpetual obligation, and the right to constantly remind me of my supposed debt. My two cats, Oliver and Duchess, who had been my faithful companions through the quiet years after Richard's passing, became another weapon in Veronica's arsenal. "7 cats," she'd exclaim with a shudder to anyone who would listen, conveniently inflating their number. Can you imagine the smell? We have to keep her door tightly shut, of course. My cats, a source of comfort and unconditional affection, were rebranded as symbols of my eccentricity, proof that I was slipping, becoming the crazy cat lady who lived in the basement. The most painful part was watching Daniel change. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, he began to adopt Veronica's perspective. His initial discomfort with her critiques of me slowly morphed into an acceptance, then an internalization. He started to see me not as his mother, but as a problem to be managed. Our conversations became terse, functional. He stopped asking about my day, about my feelings. Instead, he would offer unsolicited advice, usually prefaced with Veronica's latest concern. "Mom," he'd say, avoiding my eyes, "Veronica and I were talking. Don't you think it's time to consider something more?" He never specified what more, but the implication was clear. A retirement home, perhaps. A place where I wouldn't be their problem. The son I had raised, the boy who once clung to my hand, had become a stranger, his heart slowly poisoned by another's agenda. The tears I shed in that restroom were not for Veronica's insults alone, but for all the lost years, the unacknowledged pain, and the slow, agonizing realization that my own son had become complicit in my quiet suffering. The mirror in the restroom offered not just a reflection of my current pain, but also a silent witness to the extraordinary secret I had harbored for the past 2 years. While Daniel and Veronica had been busy diminishing me, casting me as the aging, dependent matriarch, I had been quietly, almost invisibly, building a new life. A life rich with companionship, respect, and an unexpected, profound love. It had begun innocently enough. A chance encounter at the local library, a place I sought refuge from the increasing chill of my family home. I was browsing the new arrivals, a historical novel in my hand, when I bumped into a gentleman reaching for a book on the same shelf. He had a kind smile, gentle eyes that crinkled at the corners, and an air of quiet dignity. His name was Henry Wellington, and like me, he was recently widowed, navigating the unfamiliar terrain of solitary grief. Our conversation started with books, then broadened to shared memories, quiet reflections on loss, and eventually hesitant dreams for the future. Our courtship was slow, gentle, unfolding with the grace of autumn leaves falling. We met for coffee, took strolls in the park, shared simple meals. There were no grand gestures, no flamboyant declarations, just a steady, growing affection rooted in mutual understanding and genuine companionship. He saw me, truly saw me, beyond the labels Veronica had so expertly plastered upon me. He saw the woman who loved to read, who cherished her cats, who found solace in quiet moments, and who still yearned for connection. One crisp autumn morning, 2 years ago, we stood before a justice of the peace in a small, unassuming courthouse. There were no elaborate vows, no sprawling guest list, just Henry and me, and two kindly strangers as witnesses. We exchanged simple gold bands, identical to the one I now traced on my finger, a quiet promise of a future built on respect and shared warmth. We kept our marriage a secret, a deliberate choice born not of shame, but of necessity. I knew with absolute certainty that Veronica would find a way to insinuate herself, to contaminate this pure and precious bond with her endless critiques and relentless manipulation. I wasn't ready to expose Henry to her toxic influence, not yet. He deserved better, and frankly, so did I. What Daniel and Veronica, and indeed most of the world, didn't know about Henry Wellington was that his unassuming demeanor, his preference for quiet libraries over bustling social events, masked an empire. He was the retired founder of Wellington Capital, an investment firm that even now managed billions of dollars in assets for a vast array of corporations, institutions, and high net worth individuals. His name, though not splashed across tabloids, was synonymous with immense wealth and formidable influence in the financial world. He lived simply by choice, not by necessity, a testament to his values. He often joked that he had enough money to buy his own library if he wanted, but preferred the public one for the chance encounters it offered. Like ours. The irony, sharp and delicious, was not lost on me. Wellington Capital, Henry's brainchild, the very firm that had secured his staggering fortune, also happened to manage the investment portfolio for several companies, including, quite notably, Veronica's burgeoning marketing agency. My step-grandson, Marcus, was already being groomed to eventually take over Daniel's role at the company, completely oblivious to the fact that his family's financial stability, much of it dependent on Veronica's business ventures, rested in the hands of the very man whose wife they openly scorned. I touched my wedding ring again, the cool metal, a quiet promise against my skin. The moment was near. I had felt it for weeks, a building pressure like the calm before a storm. A letter had arrived at my modest P.O. box just yesterday from Henry's lawyer, a formidable woman named Ms. Albright. It mentioned an important business meeting scheduled for today. A meeting that Henry had, with a wink and a squeeze of my hand, informed me would change everything. A soft knock on the restroom door pulled me from my reverie. "Grandma Eleanor, are you okay?" It was Clara, her voice soft and worried. I quickly smoothed my expression, erased the knowing smile, and opened the door. Clara stood there, her beautiful face etched with concern, a stark contrast to the joy her wedding day should have brought. "Grandma, I'm so sorry about Veronica," she whispered, her eyes welling up. "She can be so... I don't know why she does it." I reached out and gently squeezed her hand, her skin cool beneath my touch. "It's all right, my dear," I reassured her, forcing a warmth into my voice that I didn't entirely feel. "Don't you dare let it spoil your day. This is your day, Clara, your beautiful day." I smiled, a genuine one this time, for her sake. She needed to know I was strong, that her grandmother wouldn't crumble. Just then, my phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from Henry. My heart skipped a beat. "On my way to pick you up," it read. "Important meeting moved to tonight. Are you ready?" A shiver of anticipation ran down my spine. The time had come. The long game, played with such quiet endurance, was finally reaching its climax. I looked at Clara, her eyes still clouded with worry, and then back at my phone. More ready than I've ever been, I typed, a triumphant smile spreading across my face. Clara's hand lingered in mine for a moment longer before we both took a deep breath and stepped back into the dazzling chaos of the reception. The music swelled, a generic pop song that made the chandeliers jiggle slightly, and the murmur of conversation resumed. We walked slowly, making our way back towards our table, a quiet island in the bustling room. My heart was thrumming with a mixture of nervous excitement and a strange, exhilarating anticipation. The text from Henry was still fresh in my mind, a secret kept tight within my grasp. Just as we reached the periphery of our table, a sudden shift in the atmosphere swept through the room. A ripple of whispers started near the grand entrance, followed by the subtle turning of heads. The music seemed to fade slightly, or perhaps it was just my heightened senses making everything else recede. Everyone, it seemed, sensed the arrival of someone important. Then he appeared. Henry. He stood framed in the archway, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, its understated elegance speaking volumes. His silver hair, usually a bit disheveled from his library visits, was neatly combed, adding to his distinguished air. He wasn't overtly flashy, there was no swagger, no loud entrance. Instead, he exuded a quiet, almost magnetic authority, a powerful presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He simply was. His eyes, usually twinkling with gentle humor, now held a focused intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller, more attentive. I noticed the venue coordinator, a young woman who had been gliding through the room with practiced ease, suddenly stiffen. She looked flustered, her hand nervously adjusting her earpiece, her eyes wide as she ushered a discreet security guard closer to the entrance. It was clear Henry's arrival was not merely unexpected, but had caused a minor ripple in the meticulously planned event. He hadn't RSVP'd, of course. Henry's gaze swept across the room, taking in the opulent decorations, the hundreds of guests, the celebratory chaos. It was a discerning look, one that seemed to miss nothing, yet judged little. Then his eyes found mine. Instantly, the intensity in them softened, melting into a familiar warmth that made my breath catch. A small, knowing smile touched his lips, a silent promise. My heart fluttered. At the other end of the ballroom, Veronica naturally was holding court. She was always the center of attention, a vibrant, glittering figure in a dress that cost more than my annual income. She was laughing loudly at something Daniel had said, surrounded by a deferential circle of admirers. But even from that distance, I saw her head snap up, her predatory gaze zeroing in on Henry as he began to move purposefully into the room. She paused mid-sentence, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before quickly reforming into something sharper, more calculating. She had a keen nose for power and influence, and Henry, even in his quiet elegance, practically radiated both. With an almost imperceptible nod to Daniel, Veronica detached herself from her circle. She moved with a practiced, almost predatory grace, her sequined dress shimmering, as she glided effortlessly towards Henry, her hand already extended, a bright, confident smile fixed on her face. She reached him just as he was about to pass the first row of guest tables. "Well, hello there," she chirped, her voice perfectly modulated, oozing charm. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Veronica Morrison, mother of the bride, and your hostess tonight." She gestured grandly to the ballroom, as if she had personally conjured the entire spectacle. Her hand remained outstretched, waiting for him to take it. Henry paused. He looked at her hand, then at her face, his expression polite but utterly unreadable. A flicker of something in his eyes. Was it amusement? Disdain? Passed so quickly I almost missed it. Then, without breaking his stride or even a moment's hesitation, he simply, politely, and firmly stepped around her, his path unwavering. Her extended hand hung in the air, forgotten, unacknowledged. He continued walking, directly towards me. Veronica's confident smile faltered, her perfectly sculpted features betraying a hint of surprise, then irritation. Her hand slowly dropped to her side, but she was nothing if not persistent. She quickly recovered, her smile snapping back into place, albeit a little tighter. She turned, falling into step beside him, matching his pace. "I'm so sorry," she began again, her voice slightly louder, laced with a forced lightness. "The music is so loud I must not have caught your name. Are you a friend of Liam's family, or perhaps a colleague of Daniel's?" She pressed on undeterred, clearly fishing for information, already sizing him up for potential networking opportunities. "It's such a pleasure to have you. Perhaps we could connect later. I run a highly successful marketing agency, Morrison and Associates. We're always looking for strategic partnerships, investment opportunities." Henry stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head just slightly, fixing Veronica with a look that was devoid of malice, yet utterly chilling in its dismissive finality. His voice, when he spoke, was low, even, and carried an undeniable gravitas that cut through the surrounding noise. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," he said, his tone devoid of any warmth or interest. "But I have no need for your services. And I assure you, you are mistaken if you believe we have anything to discuss." With that, he turned away from her completely, leaving her standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. The bright, confident Veronica, the one who effortlessly charmed and manipulated everyone in her orbit, was utterly dismissed, completely irrelevant. She stood there for a long moment, a statue of stunned disbelief, as Henry continued his purposeful walk. My breath hitched. A wave of nervous excitement, electric and thrilling, coursed through me. He was coming. He was truly here, and he was not playing their game. If you're enjoying this story and want to see how this incredible twist unfolds, don't forget to keep watching. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. Henry reached me then, his presence radiating a quiet strength that felt like a protective shield. He stopped directly in front of me, his eyes so full of warmth and understanding, meeting mine. A slight smile played on his lips, a shared secret between us. My heart hammered against my ribs, a thrilling drumbeat. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone, audible enough to turn the heads of the few guests nearby who hadn't already been mesmerized by his entrance. But it wasn't just my first name that caught their attention. "My dearest Mrs. Wellington, I apologize for my tardiness. Traffic was unusually heavy." Mrs. Wellington, the name hung in the air, foreign and shocking to my family's ears. It was a name they had never heard, never associated with me. A gasp, barely audible, escaped from a woman at the next table, her champagne flute almost slipping from her grasp. He leaned in, placing a gentle, tender kiss on my cheek, the warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the coldness I had endured all evening. "It's quite all right, darling," I replied, my voice a little shaky with emotion, but steady enough to carry. The word darling, used so naturally, so intimately, sent another ripple of surprise through the onlookers. I felt a blush creep up my neck, but it was a blush of triumph, not shame. Daniel, who had been watching the scene unfold from a few feet away, his face a mask of utter bewilderment, finally managed to gather his wits. He strode forward, his brow furrowed, confusion warring with a flicker of something almost like anger. "Mom, who is this?" he demanded, his eyes darting between Henry and me. Then turning to Henry, he added, "And I'm sorry, sir, but I don't recall you being on the guest list. I didn't know you were coming." Henry turned to face Daniel, his expression polite but distant, his gaze cool. "Mr. Morrison," he acknowledged, giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His tone conveyed no familiarity, no warmth, no recognition of Daniel as my son, or even as the groom's father. It was the tone one might use for a minor acquaintance, or perhaps a problematic employee. It was clear and deliberate, and it stung Daniel, I could tell, even if he couldn't articulate why. Behind Daniel, Veronica had finally shaken off her stupor. Her dismissed hand, her shattered ego were quickly being papered over with a brittle, determined smile. She approached, her eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed the situation, trying to regain control. "Eleanor," she began, her voice falsely sweet, "why didn't you mention you were seeing someone? We would have loved to include him." She gestured vaguely toward the entire wedding, as if she had the power to extend such an invitation. The implication, of course, was that I had been keeping secrets, that I was being deliberately difficult. Henry turned to me, his feigned surprise a masterful performance. "My dear," he said, his voice laced with mock concern. "You haven't told them?" He raised an elegant eyebrow, as if genuinely perplexed by my oversight. I met his gaze, my heart soaring with a mixture of mischief and pure satisfaction. "Well, Henry," I said, choosing my words carefully, allowing just a hint of a weary sigh to escape. "I wasn't sure the timing was right. Family gatherings can be so complicated, as you well know." My eyes flickered towards Veronica, a subtle message in their depths. The lie was a necessary evil, a cover for the truth I was about to unleash. Henry nodded, a solemn expression on his face, as if he completely understood the delicate intricacies of my family dynamics. Then, he turned to face the room, his voice gaining volume, projecting with an effortless clarity that commanded immediate attention. The general hum of the reception began to die down, heads turning, conversations pausing. "For those of you who don't know me," Henry announced, his voice carrying authority, echoing slightly in the grand ballroom. "My name is Henry Wellington." He paused, letting the name hang in the sudden quiet, allowing it to register with those who might recognize it. I saw a few older, more established guests exchange wide-eyed glances. "And Eleanor isn't just seeing someone," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the now silent crowd, resting pointedly on Veronica's pale face. "She's my wife." The bombshell landed with the force of a physical explosion, though no sound was made. The room, which moments before had been filled with the joyous cacophony of a wedding reception, fell utterly, completely silent. Not a single champagne flute clinked, not a whisper disturbed the stunned stillness. Every single guest, from the most distant cousin to Clara's new father-in-law, stood frozen, their faces a tableau of disbelief, their eyes wide with shock as they processed the incredible revelation. Daniel's face, already pale with confusion, drained of all color. His lips parted, and he managed to whisper a single incredulous word. "Wife?" It was less a question and more a strangled cry of utter incomprehension. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, heavy with the weight of unspoken questions and stunned disbelief. Every eye was on Henry and me, and most acutely on Daniel, who stood frozen, his mouth agape. It was as if a sudden, unexpected theatrical performance had interrupted the planned program, and the audience was captivated. Henry, however, seemed utterly unperturbed by the sudden spotlight. He turned to the bewildered faces, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Eleanor and I have been happily married for just over 2 years now," he stated, his voice calm and conversational, as if announcing the weather. "We kept it private at Eleanor's gentle insistence. She's always been a woman who values her independence and prefers a quiet, unassuming life, separate from certain complications." His gaze flickered towards Veronica for a fraction of a second, a subtle dagger disguised as an innocent observation. Veronica, who looked as though she had been physically slapped, finally found her voice. Her perfectly composed facade, usually impenetrable, was cracking around the edges. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of disbelief and fury, darted between Henry and me. 2 years, she choked out, her voice a raw whisper, barely recognizable. "Married for 2 years? Why on earth would you keep something like that a secret, Elsner? What could you possibly be hiding?" The accusation in her tone was palpable, as if I was the one who had committed some grave offense by finding happiness outside of her control. Henry, ever the gentleman, stepped in, his voice smoothly deflecting her venom. "Eleanor simply prefers discretion, Mrs. Morrison," he explained, his tone even. "She has her own life, her own interests, her own choices, and I, for one, admire that fiercely independent spirit." His words were a direct counter to every narrative Veronica had ever constructed about me, the helpless, dependent old woman. Daniel, finally shaking himself from his stupor, took a step forward. "Mom," he pleaded, his voice a mixture of hurt and genuine confusion. Why didn't you tell us, your own son?" I looked at Daniel, and for a fleeting moment, a pang of sadness went through me. But it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of years of neglect, of his complicity in Veronica's cruelty. "Daniel," I began, my voice soft but firm, "there were reasons. Reasons that perhaps we can discuss another time. The implication was clear. Not here, not now, not when Veronica was hovering like a vulture. Just then, Henry's phone, a sleek, minimalist device, buzzed almost imperceptibly in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and nodded. Ah, he said, tucking it away. It seems our meeting has been moved up. We really must be going now. He turned to me, offering his arm with an elegant flourish. Come along, my dear. We have a rather important investor meeting to attend. I took his arm, my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of what was to come. As we began to turn, Henry paused, turning back to face the still stunned gathering, his gaze once again falling on Veronica. And Eleanor's input will be absolutely crucial for this particular discussion, he added, almost as an afterthought, especially regarding the Morrison account. There have been some rather interesting developments. The words Morrison account hit Veronica like a physical blow. Her already pale face cycled through an astonishing array of emotions. Initial confusion, followed by a dawning recognition, and then a slow, horrifying realization. Her eyes widened, focusing on Henry with an intensity that bordered on panic. The name of her marketing agency was Morrison and Associates. Could it be a coincidence? Or worse? Henry, observing her reaction with polite, almost clinical interest, smiled faintly. Morrison Marketing Solutions, he clarified, as if just remembering the full name. Yes, you wouldn't happen to know anything about that company, would you, Mrs. Morrison? His tone was innocent, almost playful, but his eyes held a steel that was unmistakable. Veronica's face drained of the last vestiges of color. The implications, like cold tendrils, began to wrap around her. Her carefully constructed world, built on her perceived power and influence, was starting to crumble around her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out immediately. Henry, still feigning mild curiosity, added, Didn't someone mention earlier that there was a Morrison in the wedding party? What a delightful coincidence. Such a small world, isn't it? He paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of his words. Veronica finally managed to stammer out a reply, her voice thin and reedy. I work there, she whispered, her usual confidence completely shattered. It's my company. Henry's smile widened, a genuinely charming yet utterly devastating smile. Ah yes, so you mentioned earlier, didn't you? He gave a slight, dismissive shrug. Well, Mrs. Morrison, he stated, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that cut through the silence like a razor. I don't just have a connection to your company, I own it. The full weight of his statement crashed down on Veronica, on Daniel, and on everyone else in the room. The air shimmered with the enormity of the revelation. Her company, her pride, her source of status and wealth, was his. And Eleanor's. The atmosphere in the ballroom, already thick with shock, solidified into a palpable tension. Veronica, utterly stunned, seemed to shrink before our eyes. Her initial disbelief morphed into a frantic scramble to process the impossible information. Henry's voice, calm and precise, cut through the silence. To be more specific, Mrs. Morrison, he clarified, his gaze unwavering, Wellington Holdings, my primary investment vehicle, acquired Morrison Marketing Solutions through one of our subsidiaries approximately 18 months ago. Veronica's face went from pale to an ashen gray. 18 months ago. The timeline clicked into place for her, a sickening realization. It was precisely 18 months ago that she had secured her latest, most celebrated promotion, becoming the CEO of Morrison Marketing Solutions. A promotion she had flaunted relentlessly, boasting of her singular talent and unparalleled business acumen. All this time, she had been working under the umbrella of a company owned by the man standing before her, the man who was now married to the old lady in the basement. Daniel, still reeling, turned to me, his voice strained with confusion. Mom, he stammered, did you know about this? You knew Veronica's company was his? He couldn't quite bring himself to say his wife's company, the words clearly sticking in his throat. Henry, however, answered for me, his tone dry. Eleanor and I discuss my business interests quite regularly, Daniel, he explained, a slight, almost imperceptible emphasis on my business interests. And she often offers very insightful comments on the various accounts we manage. The Morrison account, in particular, has been a frequent topic of conversation. He fixed Veronica with a steady, unblinking gaze that held a clear, undeniable judgment. We've had some growing concerns, you see, about company culture, particularly, workplace dynamics, management effectiveness. These are all things that naturally fall under the purview of a controlling interest. Veronica's carefully constructed professional persona, her entire identity, was unraveling at an alarming pace. She tried desperately to rally, to salvage some shred of her former self. Mr. Wellington, she began, her voice quivering slightly, I assure you any family dynamics have absolutely no bearing on my professional performance. My team is highly effective, our client retention numbers are excellent, and our projections are strong. She even managed a weak, placating smile, a pale imitation of her usual confident grin. Henry simply raised an eyebrow. That's so, Mrs. Morrison, he mused, a hint of steel entering his voice. Because from what I've reviewed in your personnel file and from some rather concerning reports from various levels of your organization, the client retention numbers aren't quite as excellent as you present them. And there have been recurring concerns about communication style and, shall we say, a certain lack of empathy that has led to significant churn amongst your key employees. He paused, letting his words sink in, each one a nail hammered into her professional coffin. In fact, he continued, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a level that made everyone strain to hear, your name is already on the board meeting agenda for Monday morning. First item, Veronica's hands, which she had been clasping tightly in front of her, began to tremble visibly. The color drained even further from her face, leaving her ghost-like. She was no longer just surprised, she was terrified. Daniel, his face now flushed with anger, stepped forward again, placing himself protectively in front of Veronica. Hold on a minute, he interjected, his voice louder than before. Are you actually threatening my wife's job, Mr. Wellington, over some petty family disagreement? This is Clara's wedding. This is completely inappropriate. Henry remained perfectly calm, his demeanor unruffled. He looked at Daniel, not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that was far more cutting. Mr. Morrison, he replied, his voice firm and unwavering. Employment decisions at Wellington Holdings are never based on petty family disagreements. They are based solely on performance, professional conduct, and the overall health of the company. And when we receive multiple reports of hostile work environment issues, toxic interpersonal dynamics, and a management style that actively harms employee morale and productivity, those are matters of serious concern for the board. His gaze returned to Veronica, pinning her in place. These are not personal issues, Daniel. They are business issues. Veronica, completely out of options, turned desperately to me, her eyes wide and pleading. The woman who had just publicly humiliated me was now begging for mercy. Eleanor, she whimpered, her voice cracking, please, we're family. You wouldn't let him do this, would you? I looked at Veronica, at the fear in her eyes, at the unraveling of her carefully constructed world. It was a moment of profound vindication, a culmination of 15 years of quiet suffering. But there was no malice in my response, only a cool, detached clarity. Veronica, I said, my voice steady, I told you earlier not to let anything spoil Clara's day, and I intend to take my own advice. I won't interfere with Henry's business decisions. You heard him. These are not personal issues. They are business issues, and, I added, my gaze holding hers, I cannot control how your character or your actions ultimately reflect on those business decisions. The implication was clear. Her own cruelty had set this chain of events in motion. I wasn't doing this to her. She had done it to herself. Leaving Clara's wedding with Henry was a surreal experience. The whispers and gaping stares of the guests faded into the background as we made our way out. The crisp night air felt invigorating, a stark contrast to the stifling tension we had left behind. There was no triumph in my heart, no spiteful joy, only a profound sense of closure. I felt no regrets about the revelations. The truth, in all its complexity, had finally been laid bare. As Henry's driver whisked us away, the opulent ballroom a dwindling jewel in the distance, Henry looked at me, a gentle smile on his face. Are you all right, my dear? he asked, his hand gently covering mine. More than all right, Henry, I replied, a soft sigh escaping me. Relieved mostly, though I imagine the consequences for Veronica and Daniel will be unpleasant. Henry nodded, inevitably, but necessary, I believe. Some lessons are best learned through direct experience. We arrived at Henry's downtown office, a sleek, modern tower that felt a million miles away from the wedding reception. Ms. Albright, Henry's astute lawyer, greeted us, her expression professional, but with a hint of admiration in her eyes as she looked at me. The investor meeting began promptly, a clinical and efficient affair. It was during this meeting that the true extent of Veronica's professional predicament became clear. Mr. Wellington, Miss Elmo, Albright began, her voice crisp. We've received confirmation that 3 major clients have initiated the process of pulling their accounts from Morrison Marketing Solutions this evening. Their cited reasons uniformly point to Ms. Morrison's unprofessionalism, specifically regarding a dismissive and condescending communication style. One even mentioned a direct incident involving a public outburst at a recent industry event. My phone, which I had silenced, buzzed incessantly in my purse. I knew without looking who it would be. A desperate chorus from Daniel, Veronica, and even Matthew, Clara's new husband, all undoubtedly filled with blame and accusations. I finally checked it, seeing a string of frantic texts and missed calls. Daniel's latest message flashed across the screen. Mom, I don't know what game you're playing, but this has gone too far. Veronica's job is on the line. You have to stop this. I simply deleted it, the words holding no power over me anymore. Henry, ever thorough, pulled up a series of internal reports and client feedback forms on a large screen. The damning evidence scrolled by, consistently condescending, unprofessional and often hostile, difficult to work with, creates unnecessary friction. It painted a picture of a leader whose arrogance had overshadowed any actual talent, a woman whose toxic personality had finally caught up with her. During a brief recess, my phone rang again. It was Pamela Davies, an old family friend and a social climber of the highest order. Her voice was suddenly overly sweet, dripping with concern. Eleanor, darling, I just heard, the news at the wedding. Such a surprise. Are you truly well? And about Daniel's business. Are there really complications? Her opportunistic curiosity was barely concealed beneath a veneer of false sympathy. I politely cut her off, promising to call her back, a promise I knew I wouldn't keep. The investment meeting resumed, the discussion clinical and devoid of emotion. The options for Morrison Marketing Solutions were laid out. Significant restructuring to address the management issues, a drastic downsizing or outright sale. The decision was made to begin with immediate leadership changes and a comprehensive review, with the strong likelihood of the company being sold off within the next quarter if performance didn't dramatically improve. 3 weeks later, I was settling into Henry's beautiful, sprawling home overlooking the ocean. My basement apartment and its associated indignities were a distant memory. My peace was immense, a quiet, deep contentment I hadn't known in decades. I had changed my phone number, cutting off the relentless barrage of calls and texts that had tried to drag me back into their drama. Henry informed me that Veronica had been officially let go from Morrison Marketing Solutions. The board had offered her a junior-level position in a different subsidiary, a lifeline perhaps, but she had proudly, vehemently declined. Her ego, it seemed, was still intact, even if her career was not. Daniel, in a desperate attempt to salvage his wife's career and perhaps his own standing, had tried to negotiate with Henry. He offered to include me more in family events to ensure I felt respected, if only Henry would reconsider Veronica's termination. Henry, with his characteristic calm, simply told Daniel that employment decisions were separate from personal relationships and warned him that any further attempts to interfere or harass Eleanor would be met with appropriate legal action. Then, Clara visited. She arrived at Henry's home alone, looking distraught, her eyes red-rimmed. She flung herself into my arms, sobbing apologies for not defending me, for not seeing the truth sooner. "Grandma," she cried, "I'm so sorry. I should have stood up for you." She told me about the chaos at home. Matthew, her husband, influenced by Daniel, was blaming me for everything, claiming I had manipulated Mr. Wellington to destroy their family. It was a ludicrous accusation, but it spoke volumes about their inability to accept responsibility. Clara, however, had seen through it. She recounted Veronica's past cruelties, the subtle slights, the overt humiliations, now stripped bare of any plausible deniability. She saw the systematic nature of the abuse, the slow erosion of my dignity that had been happening for years. "I won't be like them, Grandma," Clara declared, wiping her tears, her jaw set with a newfound determination. "I will be better than they taught me to be." She chose my side not out of obligation, but out of a deep-seated desire for justice and a genuine love for her grandmother. As I sat there with Clara, holding her hand, I reflected on my own transformation. The Eleanor who had endured 15 years of quiet suffering was gone. I no longer needed their approval, their acceptance, or their grudging charity. My peace came from within, from a relationship built on genuine respect and dignity. My only regret, I realized, was not the path I had chosen, but the path I had endured for so long. I regret that I spent 15 years accepting less than I deserved because I was afraid of losing what little I had. But now, with Henry by my side and with Clara's love, I had built a new life, a new family, where respect was not a luxury, but a fundamental right. And in that, I found complete peace.